October 3, 1943. A village schoolhouse 12 kilometers south of Cassino, Italy. Captain Robert Harmon sat at a wooden desk that still smelled of chalk dust and childhood, reading an order that made his hands shake. The typewritten words were clear. Precise. Official. They commanded him to do something he knew would destroy his men. Not kill them. Destroy them. The order came from division. 23 Italian civilians in the village had been accused of providing shelter to partisans after last week's ambush. 3 American soldiers had died in that attack. The division commander wanted retaliation. Wanted deterrence. The order specified that Captain Harmon's company would execute the civilians at dawn tomorrow. Every man in the company would participate. Firing squad. Shared responsibility. Harmon was 28 years old. Before the war, he taught history at a small college in Vermont. He'd enlisted in 1941 believing in clear moral lines. Democracy against fascism. Freedom against tyranny. Simple divisions that made sense in lecture halls and recruiting posters. Italy had complicated everything. The Italian campaign was not France. Not the clean liberation narratives that would come later. Here, the lines blurred. Former allies became enemies, became co-belligerents. Partisans fought Germans. Germans executed civilians. Civilians hit partisans. American soldiers died in ambushes, and anger demanded targets. Harmon's company had been in Italy since Salerno, 14 months of grinding mountain warfare. They'd taken casualties in every engagement. Lost friends to snipers, mortars, booby traps, and disease. His men were exhausted, bitter, and increasingly indifferent to Italian suffering. They'd seen too many destroyed towns. Too many crying children who might or might not be concealing weapons. Too many smiling villagers whose brothers might be setting mines on the roads at night. The schoolhouse was quiet. Outside, his company was bivouacked in farmhouses and barns, cooking rations, cleaning weapons, writing letters home. They didn't know yet. Lieutenant Morrison sat across the desk, reading his own copy of the order. He looked up at Harmon with a question in his eyes that he didn't voice. Morrison was 22, from Texas, promoted after their previous lieutenant died at the Volturno River crossing. He was a good officer. Brave, tactical, respected by the men. He was also beginning to show signs of what the medics called combat fatigue. What an earlier generation had called shell shock. What would later be called PTSD. His hands tremored slightly when he thought no one was watching. Captain. Morrison's voice was careful. We executing civilians now? Harmon didn't answer immediately. Through the schoolhouse window, he could see the village square. Elderly women in black dresses. Children playing near the fountain. A priest sweeping the church steps. Normal life continuing in the shadow of war, pretending occupation was tolerable if you kept your head down and caused no trouble. 23 of these people were marked for death tomorrow morning. Old men. Women. 2 teenagers. The partisan connection was circumstantial at best. Someone had seen people entering certain houses after dark. Someone else reported food disappearing. No weapons found. No actual evidence. Just suspicion hardened into certainty by anger and the need for someone to pay. Division says we are, Harmon replied finally. His voice sounded distant to his own ears. Morrison shifted in his chair. Men won't like it, sir. Shooting prisoners is one thing. But civilians? In front of the whole village? That was the point, Harmon knew. Division wanted a spectacle. Wanted every Italian in the region to understand that helping partisans carried consequences. Collective punishment. Terror as policy. Standard counterinsurgency doctrine, justified by manuals and the exigencies of war. It was also murder. Harmon had read enough history to recognize the pattern. Occupying armies facing resistance movements always reached this point. German reprisals in Russia and the Balkans followed the same logic. Kill 10 civilians for every soldier lost. Burn villages. Create wastelands of fear. Some commanders believed it worked. Some believed it was necessary. Some just followed orders and let historians judge later. Captain Harmon had 18 hours to decide who he was. The schoolhouse had blackboards still covered with Italian multiplication tables. Children's drawings pinned to walls. A globe in the corner showing a world that no longer existed, with borders that had been redrawn by violence. Harmon stared at it and thought about the men under his command. Sergeant Davies, who'd lost his brother at Kasserine Pass and carried that rage in everything he did. Private Kowalski, who crossed himself before every meal and every firefight, still believing God watched over American soldiers. Corporal Chen, who never talked about what happened to his unit at Salerno but sometimes woke up screaming. These were not evil men. They were soldiers trying to survive. Trying to make sense of a war that made no sense. Trying to follow orders in a campaign where victory looked like more months of dying in Italian mud. If he ordered them to execute those civilians tomorrow, they would do it. Some reluctantly. Some with grim determination. Some without visible emotion because emotion was a luxury none of them could afford anymore. And afterward, they would never be the same. Not because killing changed you. They'd all killed. Combat soldiers learned to kill efficiently, without hesitation. That transformation had already happened. But there was a difference between killing enemy soldiers in battle and executing handcuffed civilians in a village square while children watched. A difference his men still understood even if division had forgotten. Permission to speak freely, sir. Morrison's voice pulled Harmon back. Granted. I've been in 3 campaigns. I've done things I don't talk about in letters home. Things that seemed necessary at the time. Morrison paused, choosing words carefully. But if we do this tomorrow, we're no different than the SS. We're executing hostages to terrorize a population. That's not what I enlisted for. Harmon met his eyes. You volunteering to tell division we're refusing orders? No, sir. Just saying what you're already thinking. The order sat on the desk between them. Official. Legally constituted authority flowing from the chain of command. Division. Corps. Army. Supreme Allied Commander. The entire apparatus of military justice and wartime necessity compressed into 3 typewritten pages. Disobeying that order meant court-martial. Possibly execution. At minimum, disgrace. His career destroyed. His family shamed. And for what? Those 23 civilians would probably die anyway. Division would just send another company. Another officer willing to follow orders. Nothing would change except Harmon's own destruction. But his men. His men would change. He'd watched it happen in other units. Watched companies that participated in reprisal killings lose something essential. Watched them become harder. Crueler. Watched them start treating every Italian as an enemy. Start looting with systematic thoroughness. Start taking pleasure in causing fear. Not because they were inherently evil, but because once you cross certain lines, it becomes easier to keep crossing them. Easier than trying to maintain distinctions that military reality kept eroding. Get me the roster, Harmon said quietly. I want to know which men have families. Children. Morrison looked confused but retrieved the document. They went through it together. Baker Company, 168th Infantry Regiment. 134 men. 78 had families back home. 41 had children. Young children who would grow up hearing stories about what their fathers did in the war. Stories that shaped how those children understood the world, understood America, understood what their fathers believed was right and wrong. What story would those children hear? Outside, the autumn sun slanted low through cypress trees. Somewhere in the village, those 23 condemned civilians were eating what might be their last meal. Somewhere else, his soldiers were playing cards, reading letters, trying to forget they were in Italy instead of home. And in a schoolhouse that still smelled like childhood innocence, Captain Robert Harmon made his decision. He would ignore the order. Not refuse it openly. Not debate it. Not request clarification or appeal through proper channels. He would simply fail to execute it. He would let the deadline pass. He would create confusion. He would report communications difficulties. He would buy time. And he would see what happened. It was not heroism. It was quiet subversion. The kind of resistance that leaves no dramatic record. No speeches. No manifestos. Just a captain deciding that some orders deserved to be disobeyed because following them would cost more than disobeying them could. The decision made, the next question was how. Harmon couldn't simply announce to his company that they were ignoring division's order. Many of his men would follow him, but not all. Some believed deeply in the chain of command. Some were angry enough about the ambush to want revenge. Some would report him immediately out of belief that refusing orders in wartime was treason. He needed a different approach. Something that would delay execution without requiring his men to become conspirators. Lieutenant Morrison, I need you to take a patrol out tonight. Reconnaissance in force toward San Pietro. Division wants updated intelligence on German positions before tomorrow's advance. Morrison understood immediately. Sir, that'll take all night. We won't be back until after dawn. Exactly. Take 40 men. The veterans. The ones who've been here longest. It was a surgical extraction. The soldiers most likely to follow the execution order without question, most hardened by combat, most angry about losing friends. Take them out of the village for 12 hours and they couldn't participate. If they weren't there, they couldn't refuse. Couldn't be complicit. Couldn't carry the weight. Morrison nodded slowly. Roster? They went through it again. Sergeant Davies. Private Kowalski's team. The machine gun squad that had lost men at Volturno. The riflemen who'd been with the company since North Africa. One by one, Harmon assigned the most dangerous, most necessary, most vulnerable soldiers to the patrol. The remaining 94 men were younger replacements, less experienced, less hardened. Men who joined after the worst fighting. Men who might still believe war had rules. Men who might hesitate before shooting a grandmother in a village square. What about the execution detail? Morrison asked. Division specified the whole company participates. We'll have communication difficulties, Harmon said. Radio trouble. Messengers delayed. By the time division realizes what happened, circumstances will have changed. It was a thin justification. Division would see through it immediately. But it bought time. And time changed everything in war. Maybe the order would be countermanded. Maybe the partisans would be caught elsewhere. Maybe division would forget. Maybe God would provide a miracle. Harmon didn't believe in miracles, but he'd learned that chaos was reliable. War plans never survived contact with reality. Orders got lost, delayed, misunderstood. Units got cut off from command. Situations evolved faster than headquarters could respond. In that gap between intention and execution, a careful officer could find room to maneuver. Morrison left to organize the patrol. Harmon sat alone in the schoolhouse, listening to his men preparing for the mission. Equipment checked. Weapons cleaned. The familiar rituals of soldiers about to enter danger. They thought they were going on reconnaissance. They thought they'd return to find the village unchanged. They didn't know they were being protected. At 2,100 hours, the patrol departed. 40 men disappearing into Italian darkness, believing they were gathering intelligence about German positions. Harmon watched them go and felt the weight of what he'd done. If they encountered Germans, they might die. He was risking them to save others. The moral arithmetic was impossible. The remaining soldiers settled into guard rotations. Some slept. Some played cards. Some wrote letters by lamplight, telling families about beautiful Italian countryside while leaving out the parts about death and mud and children who looked at them with undisguised hatred. Harmon didn't sleep. He sat in the schoolhouse reviewing his defense. When division discovered the execution hadn't happened, they would demand explanations. Court-martial was likely. He needed a story that balanced plausibility with deniability. Something that acknowledged he'd made a decision while suggesting that decision was tactically sound rather than morally motivated. At 0300 hours, he radioed division. Static made the transmission difficult. Reception poor. He reported the reconnaissance patrol had encountered unexpected German resistance. Couldn't confirm status. Communication intermittent. Situation fluid. Request delayed execution of the order until situation stabilized. Over. The response came back terse and angry. Execute order as directed. Dawn. No delays. Out. Harmon acknowledged the transmission, then did nothing. The hours before dawn moved slowly. He watched the village through the schoolhouse window, wondering if the condemned civilians knew. Did they lie awake? Did they pray? Did they curse Americans for becoming what they'd fought against? Did they understand that one captain's decision might spare them, or did they just wait for the inevitable? At 0600, the sun rose over Italian mountains. The village square remained empty. No firing squad. No assembled civilians. No spectacle of power and terror. Just autumn morning light on old stones, and chickens scratching in the dirt. Division radioed at 0615. Harmon let it ring. Static. Communication difficulties. Technical problems. At 0630, Division sent a messenger on motorcycle. Harmon told him the patrol was still engaged with Germans. Casualties unknown. Unable to execute order until unit reconsolidated. Messenger departed with visible disgust. At 0800, Morrison's patrol returned. They'd spent the night in the hills, seen no Germans, completed exactly nothing. The men were exhausted, confused about the mission's purpose, but alive and blameless. They hadn't participated in what they didn't know was happening. Or rather, what wasn't happening. Harmon assembled the company at 0900. Told them reconnaissance indicated heavy German presence in the area. All operations postponed pending clarification. Defensive positions only. Stay alert. Dismissed. The men looked confused but accepted it. Confusion was normal in war. At 1000 hours, a staff car arrived from division. Colonel Patterson stepped out, face red with fury, and Harmon knew his gamble had ended. The transformation was complete. He'd ignored orders to protect his men's souls, and now he would pay for it. The confrontation happened in the schoolhouse where Harmon had made his decision 14 hours earlier. Colonel Patterson stood with rigid military posture, holding the execution order that had not been executed. Captain Harmon, explain to me why 23 Italian civilians are still breathing when I gave explicit orders for their execution at dawn. Harmon stood at attention. Sir, tactical situation required postponement. Reconnaissance patrol encountered potential German activity. Consolidating unit security took priority. Bullshit. Patterson's voice was cold. You deliberately delayed execution to avoid carrying out orders you found distasteful. That's disobedience. That's cowardice. That's court-martial. Silence filled the schoolhouse. Through the window, Harmon could see his company going about routine tasks, unaware their captain's career was ending. Unaware that he protected them from something they didn't yet know they needed protection from. Sir, Harmon kept his voice level, I made a tactical judgment that executing civilians while elements of my company were engaged with enemy forces would compromise unit cohesion and security. I reported communications difficulties and requested delay. At no point did I refuse the order outright. It was technically true. He hadn't refused. He just delayed long enough that circumstances might change. Might spare him the choice. Might spare his men the burden. Might spare those 23 civilians their lives. Patterson wasn't fooled. You think I don't know what you did? You sent your most reliable men on a fake patrol. You created artificial delays. You played games with radio communications. You thought you could ignore my order by pretending to misunderstand it. I followed proper procedure for clarification when tactical circumstances changed, sir. The only thing that changed was your spine, Captain. You got the order and you couldn't stomach it. So you decided you knew better than division. Better than corps. Better than supreme command. You decided your personal morality outweighed military necessity. Harmon met his eyes. I decided that preserving my company's combat effectiveness required protecting them from actions that would damage morale and discipline. It was the right defense, technically. Military rather than moral reasoning. Tactical judgment rather than ethical objection. It might work. It probably wouldn't, but it might. Patterson leaned back. Let me tell you what's going to happen now. You're relieved of command effective immediately. Lieutenant Morrison will assume temporary command of Baker Company. You'll return to division headquarters under arrest pending court-martial proceedings for disobeying orders in time of war. If convicted, you'll face prison. Possibly execution. Harmon nodded. He'd expected this. Accepted it. The cost of his decision. However, Patterson continued, his voice changing slightly, before I process those charges, I need to determine if your supposed tactical concerns had any basis in reality. Lieutenant Morrison, did your patrol encounter German forces last night? Morrison, who'd been standing silently in the corner, straightened. This was the moment. He could confirm Harmon's story or expose it as fiction. He could save his captain or follow his own conscience about truth and military justice. Yes, sir, Morrison said clearly. We encountered German reconnaissance patrol near San Pietro. Brief firefight. No casualties our side. Germans withdrew. We continued mission. It was a lie. A complete fabrication. Nothing had happened on that patrol except 40 men walking through Italian countryside in darkness, wondering why they'd been sent on such a pointless mission. But Morrison was giving Harmon cover. Creating plausible justification. Risking his own career to protect his captain. Patterson's eyes narrowed. You're certain? Yes, sir. I filed a report this morning. Would you like to see it? There would be no report. There couldn't be. But challenging Morrison meant investigating further, interviewing the 40 men, creating more complications. Patterson had come to arrest Harmon, not to conduct tactical analysis. The convenient lie let him save face while reassessing. I'll review that report, Patterson said slowly. Then he turned back to Harmon. Captain, you have 24 hours to provide written justification for your actions. If your tactical reasoning proves sound, charges may be reconsidered. If not, you'll face court-martial. Clear? Yes, sir. Patterson left. The staff car disappeared toward division headquarters. And Captain Harmon remained in command of Baker Company, at least for one more day. Morrison waited until the car was gone, then spoke quietly. Sir, what do we do now? Now we write the best tactical justification for postponing a civilian execution that anyone's ever written. And we pray Patterson doesn't send someone to interrogate the patrol. They worked through the afternoon. Harmon composed a detailed report explaining how German activity near San Pietro had created security concerns that superseded the execution order. How dividing his company's attention between executing civilians and maintaining perimeter defense could have created vulnerabilities. How consolidating forces before undertaking controversial actions was sound tactical doctrine. It was bureaucratic fiction. But military operations ran on such fictions. Reports that justified decisions already made. After-action assessments that framed chaos as strategy. The paperwork of war that transformed messy reality into clean narrative. That night, word reached them that division had postponed all civilian reprisals pending review of security situation. The 23 condemned civilians would not be executed. New intelligence suggested partisan activity was concentrated elsewhere. Resources would be directed to actual enemy targets rather than suspected collaborators. It was a victory achieved through delay. Through confusion. Through one captain's willingness to gamble his career on the chance that time would change circumstances. Through one lieutenant's willingness to lie for his commander. Through military bureaucracy's capacity to forget orders that became inconvenient. But it wasn't justice. It wasn't redemption. It was just 23 people who got to keep breathing because an officer had quietly failed to follow orders. The next morning, Baker Company received new orders. Move north. Prepare for assault on German defensive positions near Cassino. Standard mission. Standard casualties expected. The war continued, indifferent to moral complications. Harmon remained in command. Patterson never sent investigators. The execution order was filed away, just another document in a vast machinery of military administration. What might have been a spectacle of terror became a bureaucratic footnote that nobody remembered. The 23 civilians returned to their homes. The village continued. Children played in the square where they almost died. Old women in black dresses carried water from the fountain. The priest swept church steps. Life went on, and nobody would ever know how close they'd come to being examples. Lessons. Warnings carved into other people's fears. Harmon's company never learned what their captain had done. They knew there'd been an execution order, postponed due to tactical considerations. Some grumbled about division-changing plans. Some were relieved to avoid it. None understood that their captain had protected them from carrying that weight. Sergeant Davies complained about wasted time. Private Kowalski thanked God for another day. Corporal Chin cleaned his rifle and said nothing, as always. And the company moved north toward new battles, unaware that their souls had been protected by an officer who'd quietly ignored orders. Captain Robert Harmon survived the war. He was wounded twice more, in fights that made sense, defending positions, taking objectives, covering retreats. The normal violence of combat soldiers. He never faced court-martial for the execution order he'd ignored. Patterson's promised investigation never materialized, lost in the vast chaos of the Italian campaign. After the war, Harmon returned to Vermont. Resumed teaching history at the same college where he'd worked before enlisting. He never spoke about the execution order. Not to his wife. Not to his children. Not to fellow veterans at reunion gatherings where old soldiers traded stories about combat and camaraderie. It wasn't shame that kept him silent. It was recognition that what he'd done was too small and too complicated for heroic narrative. He hadn't defied orders openly. Hadn't made dramatic speeches. Hadn't sacrificed himself in spectacular fashion. He'd just delayed an order through bureaucratic maneuvering, and circumstances had spared him consequences. That was the truth about moral courage in war. It rarely looked impressive. Rarely generated medals or memorial speeches. It happened quietly, in schoolhouses that smelled like chalk dust, made by tired officers who simply refused to destroy their own men for the satisfaction of command authority. Some of Harmon's soldiers eventually learned what had happened. Morrison told the story years later, at a Baker Company reunion in 1953. How their captain had protected them from becoming executioners. How he'd risked his career to spare them that burden. How he'd created plausible confusion rather than staged dramatic disobedience. The men who heard the story had mixed reactions. Some were grateful, understanding finally why they'd been sent on that pointless patrol. Some felt patronized, believing they could have handled the execution without moral damage. Some weren't sure what they felt, because by 1953 they'd lived 8 years with the war behind them, and memory had softened edges that had once felt sharp. But all of them remembered Italy differently after hearing Morrison's account. Remembered it not just as mud and combat and dying friends, but as a place where their captain had seen them clearly enough to protect them from themselves. The 23 Italian civilians who'd been marked for execution never knew Harmon's name. Never knew an American officer had saved them. They returned to ordinary lives, and the war eventually ended, and they told their grandchildren about the occupation and the fear and the Americans who were sometimes kind and sometimes cruel, the way occupying armies always are. One of those civilians was a teenager in 1943. She became a teacher. In 1967, she published a memoir about growing up during the war. One passage described the morning after German troops left her village, when everyone expected American reprisals for partisan attacks. How they'd waited in homes with doors barred, believing they would die. How nothing had happened. How they'd emerged at noon to discover they'd been spared, though nobody understood why. The memoir sold 3,000 copies in Italy. Harmon never read it. Never knew his decision had been recorded, in a way, through the absence of trauma in someone else's narrative. The things that didn't happen also shape history, but they leave fainter marks. In 1970, the U.S. Army conducted a study on command ethics, examining cases where officers had faced moral dilemmas during World War II. Harmon's file was reviewed. His delay of the execution order was noted as an example of how tactical judgment could be used to avoid controversial actions without directly refusing orders. The study praised his approach as a model for officers navigating the gap between legal orders and ethical concerns. The study was classified. Harmon never knew he'd been praised by an institution he'd technically disobeyed. Never knew his quiet subversion had become recommended doctrine. Never knew the Army had learned, slowly and reluctantly, that some orders should be disobeyed even if that meant sacrificing careers. By 1970, Harmon was 55 years old. Still teaching history. Still living in Vermont. Still carrying memories he didn't discuss. His students knew he'd served in Italy, but he rarely mentioned it. When pressed, he'd talk about the landscape, the food, the difficulty of mountain warfare. He never mentioned the schoolhouse. Never mentioned the order. Never mentioned the 23 civilians who'd almost died. He died in 1984, believing his wartime service had been ordinary. Believing nothing he'd done mattered beyond the small circle of men he'd commanded. Believing the execution order was a footnote that nobody would remember or care about. He was wrong. In 2003, an Italian historian researching American occupation policies discovered the execution order in archived files. She traced it to Baker Company, 168th Infantry Regiment. Traced it to Captain Robert Harmon. Traced it to the delay that became postponement that became cancellation. She interviewed surviving members of the company, including Morrison, who was 82 and willing to finally tell the complete story. The historian published an article, Silent Resistance: How One American Officer Refused to Create War Criminals. It described Harmon's decision. His careful maneuvering. His protection of men who never knew they needed protecting. It argued that such quiet defiance represented the highest form of military leadership, because it prioritized the long-term moral health of soldiers over the short-term satisfaction of commanders. The article won awards in Italy. Was translated into English. Was assigned in military ethics courses at West Point. Harmon's great-grandchildren read it and learned their ancestor had been braver than they'd known. The college where he taught history named a scholarship after him. The village in Italy erected a small marker acknowledging the American captain who chose conscience over compliance. But none of this happened during Harmon's lifetime. He died believing he'd failed to be heroic. Died believing his quiet resistance had been cowardice dressed as tactical judgment. Died never knowing that the thing he'd been most ashamed of, his inability to openly refuse an immoral order, had actually been the thing that made his resistance effective. Because dramatic defiance creates martyrs. Creates court-martials and prison sentences and broken careers. Creates examples that encourage others not to resist but to stay silent, because resistance looks too costly. Quiet subversion, the kind Harmon practiced, creates space for conscience without destroying the person acting on it. That's the uncomfortable truth about moral courage in bureaucratic systems like military command. The people who survive long enough to tell their stories are usually the ones who learn to resist without seeming to resist. Who learn to protect without claiming credit for protection. Who learn to disobey orders in ways that look like following them. It's not the heroism of movies. It's the heroism of schoolhouses and postponed orders and tactical justifications that nobody quite believes but nobody quite challenges. It's Captain Harmon sitting alone at a desk, reading an order that would destroy his men, and deciding to create confusion instead of tragedy. Morrison, who lived until 2009, gave one final interview before he died. The reporter asked if Harmon had been a hero. Morrison thought about it for a long time. Hero's the wrong word, he finally said. Heroes sacrifice themselves for others. Captain Harmon just refused to sacrifice his men's humanity for division's revenge. He didn't want medals or recognition. He just wanted his soldiers to come home still able to look their children in the eyes. Morrison paused. The thing is, we did come home. And when my kids asked what I did in the war, I could tell them I fought. I could tell them I killed enemy soldiers. I could tell them I was scared and brave and lucky to survive. But I never had to tell them I murdered civilians in a village square because someone told me to. Captain Harmon gave me that gift. He gave all of us that gift. And none of us knew it until years later. That's his legacy. Not the order he disobeyed. Not the civilians he saved. Not even the career he risked. His legacy was men who came home without certain stains. Men who could tell their children about combat without having to explain executions. Men who could remember Italy as a place where they'd fought enemies, not murdered civilians. The 23 Italians who'd been marked for death lived ordinary lives. Had children. Had grandchildren. Contributed to their communities in small ways. None of them became famous. None of them did anything history books remember. But they existed. Their children existed. Their grandchildren existed. Entire family trees that would have been cut off at dawn on October 4, 1943, if one captain hadn't decided to fail at following orders. Multiply that by 23. Calculate the weddings that happened, the children born, the meals shared, the songs sung. The accumulated ordinary life that exists because Captain Robert Harmon sat in a schoolhouse and decided his men's souls mattered more than division's demand for spectacle. That's what quiet resistance preserves. Not dramatic moments. Not heroic sacrifices. Just the continuation of ordinary life for people who would have been destroyed by others' dramatic decisions. In 2015, a museum in Cassino opened an exhibit about the Italian campaign. One small section addressed the civilian experience. Among the displays was a photograph of a village square. Below it, text described how 23 residents had been marked for execution as reprisal for partisan activity. How the execution was postponed. How circumstances changed. How they survived. The exhibit didn't mention Harmon. Didn't know about him. Just noted that sometimes orders were delayed, and sometimes delays meant life. It was bureaucratic language for a bureaucratic salvation. The most honest way to describe what happened. Because that's what it was. Not heroic defiance. Not dramatic rebellion. Just one officer creating enough confusion that murder became inconvenient, and inconvenience became postponement, and postponement became someone else's problem, and eventually nobody's problem, and 23 people kept breathing for reasons they never understood. Captain Robert Harmon would have hated the attention his story eventually received. Would have insisted he'd just done his job. Would have minimized the decision as tactical necessity rather than moral choice. That discomfort with recognition was itself part of his legacy, teaching that sometimes the most important actions are the ones we're embarrassed to claim. But the men who served under him understood. Morrison understood. The soldiers who'd been sent on that fake patrol understood, once they learned the truth. They understood their captain had looked at them clearly, had seen what they were capable of becoming if asked to become executioners, and had protected them from that transformation. Not because they were weak. Not because they couldn't have followed orders. But because some orders shouldn't be followed, and some burdens shouldn't be carried, and some transformations can't be undone. Captain Harmon died never knowing his quiet defiance would be remembered. Died believing his moment in that schoolhouse was just another wartime complication, solved through military procedure and forgotten by everyone including himself. He was wrong about that, too. But perhaps it was better that he died wrong. Died believing his resistance had been too small to matter. Died without the burden of knowing he'd been quietly heroic in a war that demanded loud heroism. The schoolhouse still stands in that Italian village. It's not a memorial. No plaque marks what didn't happen there. Children still learn in those rooms, though the multiplication tables are modern and the globe shows current borders. And every autumn, when light slants through cypress trees the way it did in October 1943, the building holds a secret. Not the dramatic secret of open defiance. The quiet secret of orders ignored. The patient secret of conscience protected. The unglamorous secret of a captain who saved his men's souls by refusing to let them become what division's anger would have made them. That's the only legacy that mattered to Captain Robert Harmon, though he never claimed it. His men came home able to live with themselves. And 23 Italian civilians got to grow old. And somewhere in the vast machinery of military bureaucracy, an execution order was filed away without being followed. The war didn't notice. History barely recorded it. But conscience survived in a schoolhouse that smelled like chalk dust, preserved by an officer who understood that sometimes disobeying orders is the most loyal thing a soldier can do.